January 30th, 2008. A team led by Professor Hans Eyberg at the University of Copenhagen released a finding that would go on to get repeated in headlines for the next 2 decades, precisely because it sounds almost too clean to be real. Every person alive today with ordinary inherited blue eyes can trace that trait back to a single, specific human being, one person who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, in whom a tiny genetic switch first flipped and dialed down the brown pigment in the iris. In green eyes, the even rarer color sitting right beside blue on the same genetic spectrum trace back to that exact same neighborhood of DNA, the same handful of genes working through a slightly different combination to produce one of the rarest eye colors on the entire planet. Understanding where green eyes actually come from means understanding this whole story, because green eyes were never their own separate genetic invention. They're a specific, delicate byproduct of the exact same ancient mutation that gave the world blue eyes in the first place. Let's start with the biology itself, because it's genuinely counterintuitive once you actually look at how eye color works at the cellular level. According to All About Vision's detailed explanation, every single eye color humans have, brown, blue, green, hazel, gray, comes down to one single pigment, melanin. The same brown-colored pigment responsible for skin and hair color too. Here's the part that surprises most people. There is no green pigment in the human eye. There's no blue pigment either. The iris only ever produces one color of pigment, brown melanin, and every other eye color you've ever seen is actually a visual illusion created by exactly how much of that brown pigment is present and how light physically scatters through the iris tissue around it. A brown iris is simply densely packed with melanin. A blue iris has very little melanin at all, and what you're actually seeing is the same physical phenomenon that makes the sky look blue. Light scattering through a translucent, largely pigment-free structure, a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering, not a blue pigment sitting there at all. The genetic machinery controlling exactly how much of that melanin your iris actually produces centers on 2 specific genes, sitting directly next to each other on chromosome 15, OCA2 and HERK2. According to Science Insight's detailed breakdown, the OCA2 gene provides the instructions for building something called the P protein, a molecule directly involved in producing and distributing melanin throughout the body. HERK2, its immediate neighbor on the same chromosome, doesn't produce melanin itself. It functions instead as a regulatory switch, controlling exactly how much the neighboring OCA2 gene actually gets expressed and put to use. According to detailed genetic research summarized by Free DNA Analyzer, there's one specific single nucleotide polymorphism, a single-letter genetic variant known by its technical code, rarest 913832, sitting inside HERC2 in a conserved enhancer region roughly 21,000 base pairs upstream of OCA2 itself, that functions as what researchers directly describe as the master switch for eye color. The ancestral version of that switch, called the A allele, allows the DNA to physically loop and fold in a way that brings a regulatory enhancer element into direct contact with the OCA2 gene's own promoter region, switching OCA2 fully on and driving robust melanin production, the recipe for brown eyes. The mutated, derived version of that same switch, called the G allele, disrupts that same chromatin looping mechanism, reducing how strongly OCA2 gets activated, cutting melanin production down dramatically, and producing the pale, largely pigment-free iris that reads to the human eye as blue. That's the exact mechanism Eyberg's 2008 study identified, and the way his team actually proved it traced back to one single ancestor, rather than having independently arisen multiple separate times in different populations, is genuinely elegant detective work. According to Science Daily's original coverage of the study, Eyberg's team began by studying 3 generations of Danish families through the Copenhagen Family Bank, tracking exactly how this genetic variant passed down through documented family trees. Then, according to Popular Mechanics' more recent retrospective on the study, the researchers extended their analysis considerably further, examining a total of 155 blue-eyed individuals from Denmark, and then comparing that Danish sample against blue-eyed individuals from 2 considerably more distant, genetically distinct populations, Turkey and Jordan. If blue eyes had arisen independently multiple separate times in different populations around the world, you'd expect the specific genetic markers surrounding that mutation to look at least somewhat different from population to population, reflecting each population's own separate genetic background. That is not what the researchers found. Every single blue-eyed individual studied, whether from Denmark, Turkey, or Jordan, carried the exact same specific stretch of DNA surrounding that HERK2 switch, the same precise string of genetic markers, inherited together as a single unbroken genetic block. According to reporting from Science Insights, That kind of genetic uniformity across such geographically and genetically distant populations is exactly the fingerprint scientists look for to identify a single founder mutation, a genetic change that arose exactly once, in one single individual, at one single point in history, and then spread outward through that person's descendants across the following thousands of years, rather than emerging independently and repeatedly in different places. Iberg's own explanation of the finding, quoted directly in the university's original 2008 press release, captures the sheer scale of what this actually means. Originally, we all had brown eyes, but a genetic mutation affecting the OCA2 gene in our chromosomes resulted in the creation of a switch, which literally turned off the ability to produce brown eyes. Every human being on Earth, at some point in our deep evolutionary past, had brown eyes, uniformly, without exception. Blue eyes, and by direct extension, green eyes too, are considerably more recent evolutionary novelties, appearing only after this one specific genetic switch first flipped in one specific person, likely somewhere in the broader region around the Black Sea, according to Science Magazine's original 2008 coverage, connected specifically to the Neolithic expansion, the period when early farming populations began migrating outward from that region into northern Europe, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, carrying this brand new genetic variant along with them as they spread. There's an important, honest scientific caveat worth including here too, because it's exactly the kind of detail that separates a genuinely accurate retelling of this story from an oversimplified, viral version of it. According to Snopes' detailed fact check of the claim, the finding that a single ancestor is responsible for all blue eyes carries an additional, genuinely mind-bending implication that most retellings of this story leave out entirely. Scientists have separately calculated humanity's broader genetic identical ancestors point, the point in time before which every single person alive on Earth today, regardless of their specific traits, shares the exact same complete set of ancestors, to somewhere between roughly 5300 BC and 2200 BC. That time frame overlaps closely with, or even slightly predates, the estimated 6,000 to 10,000 year window for the blue eye mutation itself. According to that same Snopes analysis, that overlap means it's not just true that the specific individual responsible for the original blue eye mutation is an ancestor of every blue-eyed person alive today. It's also very likely true that this same individual is an ancestor of essentially every human being alive today, brown-eyed, blue-eyed, or otherwise, given how genealogical mathematics works once you go back far enough in time. The shocking claim isn't really that blue-eyed people share one ancestor. It's that, genealogically speaking, nearly everyone alive today likely descends from that same person too, whether or not they happen to inherit the specific eye color mutation that made that person interesting enough to study in the first place. Now here's where green eyes specifically enter this exact same genetic story. Because green isn't some entirely separate genetic invention sitting off on its own, it's a considerably more delicate, considerably rarer intermediate outcome produced when the same HARC2 master switch combines with additional genetic variation elsewhere in the same broader pigmentation pathway. According to Free DNA Analyzer's detailed breakdown, beyond the primary HARC2-OCA2 switch controlling the basic light versus dark distinction. Additional genes, specifically SLC24A4 and TYR, the tyrosinase gene directly responsible for catalyzing the actual rate-limiting chemical steps of melanin production, fine-tune that basic signal further, producing the entire subtler spectrum of green, hazel, and other intermediate eye colors sitting between pure blue and pure brown. That same source identifies a specific variant within OCA2 itself, a missense mutation called RS18407, which changes a single amino acid at position 419 in the resulting P protein, specifically associated with green and hazel eye coloration, modifying the baseline HGRC2 signal rather than replacing it. Put simply, green eyes represent a genuinely narrow, delicate genetic sweet spot. Enough of the original melanin-reducing mutation to move well past brown, combined with just enough residual melanin production, modulated by these additional genes, to land specifically on green rather than sliding all the way to the near-total pigment absence that produces blue. That genetic narrowness is exactly why green eyes are so much rarer than blue eyes globally, despite both traits tracing back to overlapping genetic machinery. According to Forbes' recent coverage on the topic, only about 2% of the entire global human population has green eyes, making it one of the rarest naturally occurring eye colors on Earth. And just like blue eyes, green eyes show a genuinely striking, non-random geographic distribution. According to Debbie Burke Optical's detailed summary, green eyes appear with meaningfully higher frequency, specifically in parts of Europe. with particularly elevated occurrence in Ireland, Scotland, and across Scandinavia, populations directly descended from, or heavily influenced by, the same broad northern European migratory populations that carried the original HERC2 founder mutation outward from its likely origin point near the Black Sea thousands of years ago. The leading scientific explanation researchers have proposed isn't really about survival at all. It's about sex. According to that same Forbes analysis, the most compelling current explanation involves sexual selection, a well-established evolutionary force operating alongside ordinary natural selection, driven not by which traits help an organism survive, but by which traits make that organism more attractive to potential mates. The logic runs like this. In an ancestral European population where dark brown eyes were close to universal, any individual who happened to carry this new, rare mutation and display a lighter, more visually distinctive eye color would have stood out dramatically from everyone around them. Across countless species throughout the natural world, rare, visually conspicuous traits frequently trigger genuine, measurable mate preference, and that kind of preference, sustained consistently across many thousands of generations, is fully capable of reshaping a population's genetic frequencies just as powerfully as any purely survival-based pressure like disease resistance. A separate, earlier 2011 study published in the journal Human Genetics reached a similar underlying conclusion, according to that same Forbes reporting, identifying clear signs of positive selection acting on these specific derived alleles, patterns the researchers explicitly noted were inconsistent with pure random genetic drift. In plain terms, this mutation wasn't simply along for the ride, spreading passively through the population by chance. Something was actively favoring it, generation after generation. And the leading theory is that ancient Europeans simply found lighter, rarer eyes more visually striking and more attractive in potential partners, a preference that, compounded across thousands of years, eventually turned an extremely rare genetic novelty into the defining eye color of entire modern nations. There's a final, genuinely practical, real-world application of all this genetic knowledge worth including, because it shows exactly how directly useful this research has become well beyond simple curiosity about ancestry and eye color trivia. According to research published examining forensic applications of exactly this genetic region, the OCA2 HERC2 locus, and specifically that same RS12913-832 switch Iberg's team first identified, has become directly useful in forensic DNA phenotyping, the practice of predicting a person's likely physical appearance directly from a DNA sample recovered at a crime scene, with no other information available at all. Investigators today can take a genuinely tiny biological sample, a trace of blood, a single hair follicle, saliva left on a discarded object, and use exactly this genetic region, alongside supporting genes like SLC24A4 and TYR, to generate a scientifically grounded probability estimate of whether the person who left that sample most likely had brown, blue, or green eyes, turning what started as pure evolutionary curiosity about one ancient mutation into a genuinely practical tool now used in real criminal investigations around the world. Pull every one of these threads together, the discovery that brown eyes represent humanity's original near-universal baseline condition, the single ancient founder mutation in HERC2 that first dialed down melanin production and gave the world blue eyes roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, the additional layer of genetic fine-tuning through OCA2, SLC24A4, and TYR that produces the rarer, more delicate green in between. The genuinely powerful evolutionary selection signal suggesting ancient Europeans actively found this rare new trait more attractive in potential mates, and the modern forensic applications now built directly on top of this same genetic knowledge. And you get the real, fully accurate answer to where green eyes actually come from. Not some separate standalone genetic invention, a delicate, rare byproduct of the exact same ancient mutational cascade that first taught the human eye how to stop making so much brown pigment at all, spread across thousands of years by a population that, for reasons still actively debated by evolutionary biologists today, simply couldn't stop finding it beautiful. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they actually hear it explained properly. If you have green eyes, there is no green pigment anywhere inside them. Not a trace, not a single molecule. In fact, there's no blue pigment in blue eyes either, and there never has been in anyone, anywhere, in the entire history of the human species. Every single eye color that exists on Earth, from the palest Arctic blue to the deepest near-black brown, is ultimately built from just one single pigment, a brownish substance called melanin, the exact same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and hair. Green eyes are not colored by pigment at all in the way most people assume. They are, in a very real and physically precise sense, an optical illusion, a trick of light scattering that your own DNA has been quietly engineering inside your iris since before you were even born. Understanding exactly how that trick works, and exactly which genes control it, takes you on a genuinely remarkable tour through human genetics, ancient DNA, evolutionary biology, and even modern forensic science. To understand why green eyes exist at all, you first have to understand the physical structure of the iris itself, the colored, ring-shaped part of your eye surrounding the pupil. The iris contains melanin-producing cells, and the amount of melanin those cells actually produce is the single biggest factor determining eye color. If your iris contains a large amount of melanin packed densely throughout its front layers, your eyes will appear brown, since that pigment absorbs most of the light hitting the eye and reflects back a rich brown color. But if your iris contains very little melanin, something else entirely takes over, a phenomenon called Tyndall scattering, the exact same basic physical principle that makes the sky above your head appear blue rather than black, even though the sky itself has no blue pigment floating in it whatsoever. Short wavelength blue light gets scattered more efficiently than longer wavelengths, and in a nearly melanin-free iris, that scattered blue light bounces back out, creating the appearance of blue, built entirely from physics, rather than any actual blue coloring agent. Green eyes sit in a genuinely fascinating middle ground, arising when an iris contains a moderate intermediate amount of melanin, just enough brownish-yellow pigment to combine with that underlying blue scattering effect, and the resulting visual blend produces the specific hue our eyes and brains interpret as green. The genetic machinery controlling how much melanin an iris produces centers on two genes sitting right next to each other on human chromosome 15, named OCA2 and HERK2. OCA2 does the actual work, producing a protein involved in the machinery that determines how much melanin gets manufactured and deposited within iris cells. But OCA2 needs to be switched on, and that activation is controlled by its neighboring gene, HERK2, which contains a regulatory region functioning as a genetic dimmer switch. The single most studied variant sits at a specific genetic address labeled RS1293832, located deep inside an intron of HERT2, a full 21,000 base pairs upstream from OCA2's own promoter, yet still capable of reaching over and controlling how active OCA2 becomes. Laboratory experiments using cultured pigment-producing cells have shown that one version of this sequence allows a transcription factor to bind effectively, encouraging a physical looping of the chromosome that brings the OCA2 promoter and HERC2 enhancer close enough together to strongly activate melanin production, producing darker eyes. A different, derived version disrupts that looping, weakening the connection and cutting melanin production down dramatically, the exact genetic state that produces blue eyes, and with the right additional modifiers, green ones too. This mechanism produced one of the most genuinely startling findings in recent human population genetics, one that traces nearly every blue-eyed person alive today back to a single common ancestor. Research led by geneticist Hans Eyberg at the University of Copenhagen examined DNA from blue-eyed individuals scattered across an enormous geographic range, from Scandinavia to Jordan and Turkey, and found that essentially all of them shared the exact same specific HERC2 variant, an amount of genetic uniformity that simply doesn't happen by chance across such a dispersed population. Nearly every blue-eyed person alive today almost certainly descends at this specific genetic location from one single individual who experienced a chance mutation dialing down their own OCA2 activity for the very first time. Follow-up research places that found her mutation at somewhere between roughly 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, meaning for tens of thousands of years before that, every human being on Earth had brown eyes. Green eyes, layered on top of this same OCA2s and HERC2 machinery, turn out to be considerably more genetically complicated than the simpler blue versus brown story suggests. And that complexity is precisely why green remains the rarest commonly occurring eye color anywhere in the world. A landmark 2011 study in the journal Human Genetics helped firmly establish OCA2 and HERC2 as the primary architecture underlying eye color, but subsequent genome-wide studies have identified at least 16 additional genes, each contributing small, fine-tuning effects on top of that dominant signal. A large genetic study of a Canadian cohort of European ancestry, examining more than 5,000 participants, confirmed that HERC2 and OCA2 carry the single largest measurable effect on eye color, while uncovering several additional distinct genetic signals in that same region, evidence the whole system is more layered than a simple two-gene switch. That complexity explains a pattern geneticists have documented directly, that a meaningful fraction of people carrying the exact same low-activity HERC2 variant typically associated with blue eyes end up with green, hazel, or even brown eyes instead, proof that other genes elsewhere in the genome actively modify and override the baseline effect. Because green eyes require this genuinely delicate balance, they end up rarer worldwide than either brown or blue. Current estimates place green eyes at roughly 2% of the global population, edging out even blue in overall scarcity, though the numbers shift depending on which country researchers happen to sample. A 2014 American Academy of Ophthalmology survey found roughly 9% of Americans specifically have green eyes, compared with 45% brown and 27% blue, figures reflecting America's specific demographic mix rather than the true global rarity of the trait. Green eyes concentrate especially heavily across Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, a geographic clustering that hints at a deeper evolutionary story still being actively investigated. That evolutionary story takes a genuinely unexpected turn once researchers began examining ancient DNA extracted directly from prehistoric skeletons. In 2014, a team led by Carles Lalueza-Fox at the Spanish National Research Council sequenced the genome of a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer known as Labranja 1, roughly 7,000 years old, discovered in a cave in northern Spain. The results genuinely stunned the team. Labranja 1 carried the low-activity HERC2 variant associated with blue or light-colored eyes, but his DNA simultaneously showed notably dark skin, closer to modern sub-Saharan African populations than to the pale skin most people automatically associate with light-eyed European ancestry. Lalueza-Fox admitted the team's expectations going in turned out to be completely wrong. A remarkably similar combination turned up again in 2018 when researchers sequenced the DNA of Cheddar Man, Britain's oldest nearly complete human skeleton, dated to roughly 10,000 years old. Cheddar Man's genome echoed Labranja's almost exactly, revealing light-colored eyes paired with skin researchers, described as dark to black, a combination that appeared genuinely typical, not a rare fluke, among an entire population geneticists call Western hunter-gatherers. Together, these findings directly challenge the popular assumption that light skin and light eyes evolved together as a single adaptation, suggesting instead that light eyes appeared considerably earlier, along a genuinely separate evolutionary track. Why would a mutation-reducing pigment ever spread so successfully across ancient Europe when it offers no obvious survival advantage? A 2015 study analyzing ancient European genomes detected an unmistakable signal of active positive natural selection at the HERC2 and OCA2 locus, with a p-value of 3.2 times 10 to the negative 11th power, confident enough to say something was actively favoring the spread of lighter eyes rather than the trait, simply drifting by chance. The leading hypothesis involves sexual selection. The logic that in a population where dark eyes were the universal norm, anyone carrying this brand new, visually striking mutation would have stood out immediately. And if that novelty translated into even a modest, sustained mating preference across hundreds of generations, it could compound into exactly the kind of strong signal researchers found preserved in ancient DNA. The debate over exactly what drove that selection remains genuinely unresolved among evolutionary biologists today. The same genetic machinery has, in recent years, found itself repurposed for a very different modern application, one fusing genetics directly with computational and machine learning techniques. Forensic DNA phenotyping is a rapidly growing field focused on predicting a person's likely physical appearance, including eye color, directly from DNA evidence recovered at a crime scene, even when no matching suspect exists in any database. The most widely validated tool, HERSplex-S, examines 41 carefully selected genetic variants spanning skin, hair, and eye color simultaneously, calculating statistical probabilities based on exactly which versions a given sample carries. These systems rely on machine learning models trained on enormous reference datasets linking known variants to directly observed traits, then applied to unknown samples to generate genuinely useful investigative leads. Forensic scientists describe this kind of DNA-based prediction as functioning like a biological witness, in certain cases more objectively reliable than notoriously unreliable human eyewitness testimony, connecting a genetic mutation shaped by ancient hunter-gatherers directly to 21st century criminal investigations solved with statistical modeling those hunter-gatherers could never have imagined. Green eyes also carry one more practical wrinkle worth understanding: the fact that eye color inheritance is dramatically less predictable than the simple dominant and recessive diagrams taught in school suggest. Because eye color results from the combined effects of OCA2, HERC2, and more than a dozen additional modifying genes, geneticists now caution that predicting a child's exact eye color from parental eye color alone is genuinely unreliable. And two blue-eyed parents can, in documented cases, still produce a green, hazel, or even brown-eyed child, depending on which modifying variants each parent silently carries without their own eyes ever revealing those hidden possibilities. Put all of these pieces together, The physics of light scattering, the two-gene regulatory switch on chromosome 15, the startling ancient DNA evidence of dark-skinned, light-eyed hunter-gatherers roaming prehistoric Europe thousands of years before anyone expected. The statistically powerful evolutionary selection pressure still not fully explained, and the modern machine learning-powered forensic tools built directly on top of the same genetic foundation. And green eyes stop looking like a simple cosmetic accident of birth. They become something considerably richer, a visible physical signature written directly into your DNA by a genuinely improbable multi-thousand-year chain of chance mutations, ancient migrations, and evolutionary pressures nobody has fully untangled even now. The next time you notice someone with green eyes, or catch your own in a mirror, you are looking at the end result of a single ancient genetic dimmer switch, tuned to precisely the right intermediate setting, carried forward across hundreds of generations, reflecting scattered blue light back through a thin layer of brownish pigment, exactly the same basic physics that colors the open sky above your head.